Welcome to AP Biology. Today I want to talk to you about the electron transport chain. So this is the inner mitochondrial membrane right here. And so if we look at a mitochondrion, this is the inner mitochondrial membrane, and that's where the electron transport chain is found. If we were to look at a prokaryote, that would be analogous to the only membrane that the prokaryote has. So the electron transport chain would be here, or it would be here in the membrane. Because remember, when a eukaryote engulfs the prokaryote, this membrane came from the eukaryote, right? Here's the eukaryote engulfing. Well, let's do it here. Here's the eukaryote engulfing the prokaryote, right? So this eukaryotic membrane is the outer membrane eventually, and this inner membrane right here came from the prokaryote. So that's where the electron transport chain proteins came from. So each of these blue molecules here, these are part of the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain does exactly what it sounds. It transports electrons. So NADH, do you remember our delivery molecules, NADH and FADH2? They have taken electrons off of glucose and the breakdown products of glucose. So glucose is oxidized in glycolysis and in the Krebs cycle, broken all the way to carbon dioxide. Meanwhile, a lot of electrons and hydrogen ions have been ripped off, and they're in this delivery molecule NADH, or they're in this delivery molecule FADH2. So electrons and protons. So they're given to these electron transport chain carriers. And as they move from protein to protein to protein to protein to protein, they lose energy. And so if you think about electronegativity, that's how close an electron is held. And so the electron is held very closely here. So this one, this final protein right here, is very electronegative. And it's more electronegative than this one, which is more electronegative than this one, which is more electronegative than this one, which is more electronegative than this one. And so each time the electrons are passed from molecule to molecule, the electrons are held a little bit more tightly, which means they are a little bit more stable. They're in a little happier place, and so they have less energy. The energy that they lost is used to pump hydrogen ions through. So it's electrons that are moving from carrier to carrier, but the energy lost from the electrons is used to pump protons in here. And so what the electron transport chain ends up doing is it sets up a gradient, a hydrogen ion gradient. So hydrogen ion gradient. A gradient means a difference. So there's a difference between the intermembrane space and the matrix. So this is the intermembrane space, and you can see that it's between two different membranes, this membrane and this membrane. So if you're looking at a mitochondrion, the intermembrane space is where the hydrogen ions end up. That's right here. This stuff here is called the matrix, and that's what this part is. So we have a gradient. A gradient is a difference, and that's really what you've got in a battery. So if you have a battery, one side is going to be positive and one side is going to be negative, and that's a difference in electricity. And that's all we've got here, a difference in electricity between the intermembrane space and the matrix. There are more hydrogen ions here, more protons here than there are out here. So that's a gradient. It's both electrical and chemical, actually. Electrical because these things are charged, and chemical because it's an atom, right? It's hydrogen, so it's a chemical difference as well. So the location of the electron transport chain in eukaryotes is this inner mitochondrial membrane. The cristae are the folds like this, and each fold ends up being like a little battery. So NADH and FADH2 are the reduced forms. Those are carrying electrons. So they have the high energy electrons from the Krebs cycle and also from glycolysis. That's bad. All right, and they bring those electrons to the electron transport chain in the inner mitochondrial membrane. The electrons move from one electron carrier, so if you're NADH, you're not very electronegative really compared to these, and so you can give your electrons here, and then the electrons go to another. The electrons are really sucked off from this one to this next molecule in the electron transport chain. FADH2, whoops, FADH2 is a little bit more electronegative, so it's not able to pass its electrons to this one. Instead, it has to pass its electrons to this one. The electrons move from one electron carrier to the next, so each carrier is more electronegative, with this one being the most electronegative. The energy lost when moving to a new carrier is used to move protons across the mitochondrial, this inner mitochondrial membrane. So these molecules, this one, and this one, and this one, are proton pumps. Those proton pumps are made out of protein, so you can also call them protein pumps. So protein pumps because they're made out of protein, but proton pumps because of what they actually move. So if you're shoving protons against a concentration gradient, that's active transport, right? And we, in the past, have always talked about active transport being fueled by ATP, and it is not in this case. So this is a really cool exception. So active transport requires energy to shove stuff against a concentration gradient, to shove stuff from a low concentration to a high concentration. And in this case, the energy comes from the electrons that are being held closer and closer and closer and closer to the nucleus, not by ATP. So this is like a battery as the two electrons from NADH and FADH2. So as the two electrons from NADH move through the electron transport chain, they move 1, 2, 3 protons across, and they sort of set up this gradient, which is very much like a battery. If you're not familiar with batteries, it's also somewhat similar to the gravitational potential energy that you get with water as it flows over. The energy is lost, and you can use that energy. Well, the energy is converted, and you can use that energy to maybe move a turbine. All right, so you end up getting lots of hydrogen ions in here in the intermembrane space. And that ends up giving you, since they're hydrogen ions, it gives you an acidic intermembrane space, this place right in here. And so if you're acidic, that's a low pH, which is something that kids mess up sometimes. They think, oh, lots of hydrogen ions, lots of acid, that must be a low pH, right? So that's an easy thing to mess up. So be careful with that. So FADH2 is a little bit more electronegative. It can't pass its electrons here, so it has to go to the next one over. So it only sends 2 protons through the electron transport, only sends 2 protons into the intermembrane space. So the whole point of oxygen here, oxygen is almost the most electronegative atom that we have on the periodic table, right? It's almost the most electronegative atom on the planet. And so its job is to pull these electrons off of here and make the whole thing continue. Because if you don't have oxygen, you can't pull electrons off of this final electron transport molecule in the electron transport chain. So the whole job of oxygen is to pull electrons off of this molecule right here, the final electron transport chain molecule. It combines with hydrogen and makes water. So the carriers alternate between being oxidized and reduced, and the electrons release a little bit of energy, and that energy is used to shove protons in here, which sets up a gradient, which is a type of potential energy. And we'll talk about what that potential energy is used for later. And then oxygen is the final electron acceptor. We're going to call this whole thing the electron transport chain because it transports electrons, sets up this gradient, and now you have potential energy because you have a difference between inside and outside. And that is why we breathe oxygen. The oxygen is the final electron acceptor in aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic meaning oxygen, and aerobic is the aerobic cellular respiration is the most efficient because you can have a nice long electron transport chain.